Okay, I'd like to ask another set of 6 questions for each of you to answer one, and to please try to make it a 3-minute answer. Question number 1. Tell us the information that was published in 1959 showing that if you grew up in Japan, you have a cholesterol of 120 and you almost never see a heart attack. If you move to Hawaii, your cholesterol rises to 180 and your heart attack risk triples. And then you move to Los Angeles, your cholesterol is now 210 and you have 10 times the heart attack risk than you had when you lived in Japan. That's question number 1. Question number 2. Tell us about the 2014 study by Harvard researcher Morgan Levine, where she looked at 6,000 people prospectively, where she concluded that if you're an animal protein eater, you would... Is this the same exact question I asked?
Same.
Okay, sorry, let's skip that. Okay, question 2. In the year 2000, the World Health Organization, after looking at 800 papers with 22 world experts, reported an 18% increase in cancer risk from eating processed red meat. Please tell us more about this. Number 3. It was mentioned that the Journal of the American College of Nutrition said intake of fish was correlated positively with the increased risk of diabetes. Please tell us more about this. Question 4. How did Finland in the 1970s go from having the highest heart attack rate in the world to dramatically lower? Question 5. Tell us more how Dean Ornish showed increased telomeres activity after only 3 months on a plant-based diet, and why does telomere activity matter? And question 6, is there a reason why we have to be 100% plant-based? So those are the 6 questions, if everyone would answer theirs in 3 minutes.
Okay.
I'll take the last one. Well, and then you're going to have something to say, I know. And we might just have to agree to disagree, and we're still going to be friends, I promise. Right. So the question of 100% plant-based, we talked a little bit about this type of issue last night. And I appreciated Dr. Katz's comments on this, that if you look at the blue zones, you have some Adventists in the blue zones who are vegan, but there are also Adventists who are pescatarians and vegetarian, and so not all of them are vegan. And then if you look at where the other blue zones are, they almost all eat some animal food, and some a little bit more than you might imagine. And so what I'm taking away from this is not that I think animal food is required in the diet. That's not the point that I want to make at all. What I am saying is that veganism is not required. And I think that when we draw a line in the sand and say, look, the price of admission to our club where we eat well is that you have to make this extreme change, which a lot of what we do seems very extreme to other people. What I do doesn't seem extreme to me, but it's not about me. It's about the uninitiated person sitting in Des Moines, Iowa right now, watching this on the feed, who's saying, I want to improve my diet, I want to improve my health, but I have to deal with the practicality of what I'm willing to do. And we have very good research right now about the science of change that shows that there are 2 criteria that people consider when they're getting ready to make a change of any type. And this includes diet and, if you swear at work and all kinds of things that people try to change. One is that they have to think that it's going to benefit them, and the second thing is they have to see themselves doing it. And so we have never drawn that line in the sand. First of all, because we think it's a bit scientifically disingenuous for the general population to say if you don't do this, there's no hope for you to be healthy. I don't think that that's true. And second of all, because we have to be very careful that we don't win the battle and lose the war. One last thing I'll say about this, and I know we're trying to keep these to limited time. One of the things about my company that is a little bit different than some of the other practices that you might hear about, we're a membership organization, and some of our people have been members for 25 years. This is our 25th year in business. And so we get a chance to see what happens to people over a very, very long period of time. And one of the things that we look at, of course, is health change. I mean, if you used to have migraines and you don't have them anymore, we're pretty excited about that, right? But the other thing that we look for is compliance. In other words, what kind of journey has this been for you? Did you do this for 2 weeks and quit and then resurface 6 months later and start again? And we have some people who do that. Or did you do this and maybe it wasn't perfect, but you sustained it over a very long period of time and gotten better incrementally over time? A lot of our people do that, and they even become accidental vegans. And so all in all, looking at our data for over 100,000 people in 33 countries, we think that this, let's not draw lines in the sand and make this harder than it needs to be. Let's do the level of restriction it takes to get people on the path to health, and then hopefully keep them engaged to the place where they may do more later. But I have heart attack patients who aren't vegan, who've gone 19, 20 years without an event. They're not back on their cholesterol meds. Their blood pressure is normal. And I'll take less than perfect for a long time of that rather than the cycling in and out that I see people doing all the time.
Okay, I'm going to address that same question, and I'm going to start off by saying that I agree with you 100%, that we have to meet people where they are. Because we all learned in chemistry that the likelihood that a reaction will go forward depends on how low you get the activation energy. And if you make people think they got too high a mountain to climb, they're not going to do it. But that's a really separate question from, is there benefit to excluding all animal foods from the diet? And the problem I have with the way a lot of researchers address and approach this question is they will make what I consider to be a disingenuous statement by saying, well, we don't have any evidence that being 100% vegan is better than being mostly vegan. And they're right. We don't have that evidence because nobody's done the studies yet. But that doesn't mean that it's not true. And we've got to be careful because nobody's ever done a placebo-controlled, double-blind study to prove that mothers love their children, but we know they do. Okay, so, a study is not the answer for everything necessarily. To answer this question of whether or not a strictly healthy, whole food, plant-based diet is ultimately better than a mostly whole food, plant-based diet with a little bit of animal food is going to take 20, maybe 30 or 40 years. And I'm not sure if anybody's actually doing that study yet, but it definitely needs to be done. But we don't have to wait for the study to make some inferences because we have enough scientific principles and enough evidence that point us in the right direction. The study he just asked about, the 18-year study looking at those who ate the most animal food died. They crapped out. They had more cancer. What does that tell you? Is animal food good for you? No, it's not. It's like jumping off a building. If we did a study, had 100 people jump off a 10-story building, all of them would die. If we had 100 people jump off a 2-story building, 98 of them will survive. So do we conclude that jumping off buildings is not bad for you? No. It's just you don't get as much damage at jumping from 2 stories as you do from 10, but you still get damage. And that's what the evidence, in my opinion, shows us about animal foods. It turns on genes that cause cancer. It increases inflammation in the body. Animal protein residues in the colon are basically rotted by the microbiome to release toxins that, when absorbed into the bloodstream, go alter blood-brain barrier chemistry, make you more prone to depression, anxiety, and they actually interfere with the action of oligodendrocytes and can alter brain chemistry. So, yeah, we may not have definitive proof, but we got enough evidence pointing in the right direction that I can say to someone, my recommendation is that you do all plant-based, but I don't have that proof yet, but that's where the evidence is pointing.
I could, I'll take the WHO with the cancer and the thing you hear about a lot with processed meat being a class 1 carcinogen, meaning it almost certainly is a carcinogen, and red meat being a 2A based on 800 studies that they looked at. And this has been a very interesting thing. It's been hotly debated, and it gets a little bit into what Milton was saying, because a lot of the criticism of the World Health Organization's findings were that a lot of these studies were what people say is correlation and not causation. because they're epidemiology studies. And in epidemiology, you are looking at a group of people over a long period of time and looking at their diet habits, and yes, there are all kinds of other factors. Now, in research, people don't seem to understand this. We have statistical methods to try to control for these things. So it's called multivariate regression analysis. We take a big group, like this whole group here, and we're gonna look at cancer, but if you're smoking, that's an independent cause of cancer, so all of you that smoke, you get left out of that study, in that equation. And so, as Dr. Mills was saying, we're never going to have a prospective randomized controlled trial where we randomize someone to red meat or no red meat and follow them for 20 years to see whether or not they get cancer. It's just not going to be done. It would be impossible to be done. So we do have to understand there were no randomized controlled trials that showed us that smoking is bad for us. That was all based on epidemiology and correlation. You can't just have one study of correlation, but you start getting many, and the World Health Organization looked at over 800. And you start seeing this correlation over and over again, and you have mechanistic studies. In other words, we know that red meat and processed meat increase IGF-1, and we know that's a risk factor for getting cancer. We know that when you cook meat, you get heterocyclic amines, and that is a risk for cancer. We know that there is advanced glycated end products when you cook meat, and that's a risk factor for cancer. We know that new 5-GC that's present in meat and that gets incorporated into our cells could possibly increase cancer. There's a lot of possibilities and coulds, but it all comes together into a recommendation from a group of absolute experts on this topic, more expert than we are sitting up on this panel, that came to the conclusion after a lot of research, and these aren't vegans, that said that red meat and processed meat could definitely increase cancer.
All right, we'll just keep this moving down the line here. So the 1959 study was not Japan, Honolulu, and Los Angeles as advertised. It was Japan, Honolulu, and San Francisco. It was the Niho-san study. And this was a migration study, one of the early epidemiologic landmark studies that attempted to unbundle the influence of genes versus lifestyle. The one thing that makes this both interesting and complicated is that this wasn't just a change in lifestyle. This was a change in culture. And so there were a lot of variables in flux. And one of the things we like to do in science is compress the number of variables that are in motion at one time so we can extract from studies attribution. What was responsible for causing the results that we saw? So when you do a migration study, lots of things are changing, but essentially the takeaway message from altitude was Japanese people living in Japan, traditional Japanese diets, traditional Japanese lifestyle, very low rates of obesity, heart disease, almost all cancers. Not quite all cancers. There's actually a relatively high rate of gastric cancer in Japan, but certainly overall cancer much lower than the US, overall better health. With a move to Honolulu, and that was just the migration pattern, so a lot of people who were on their way to the mainland US parked for a while in Honolulu, the diet, the lifestyle, the culture were somewhat intermediate, somewhat hybridized between a Japanese influence and a US influence. Rates of chronic disease, all this bad stuff that is so routine here in America, wound up being intermediate between the homeland in Japan and mainland US. And then the migration pattern completed itself, and these groups came over to San Francisco in particular, hence the name of the study, where rates of chronic disease approximated those of all the rest of us living here. So the particular value of the Niho-san study was to say the Japanese are not defended against American diseases by being Japanese. It's not Japanese genes that are protecting them, because the people that wound up in mainland America had the same genes that they started with, but they had our diet, they had our lifestyle, and they wound up with all of our diseases.
I'll dovetail onto that with Ornish's studies, and certainly I guess one of the sayings you may have heard before is our genes determine, may affect our risk of disease, maybe 5%. The rest is determined by diet and lifestyle, so it's really diet and lifestyle. The genes may load the gun, but diet and lifestyle pull the trigger. And Ornish's studies, he did, I mean, you're very familiar with Dean Ornish's studies on the lifestyle heart trial in 1990 and heart disease reversal. But he also did a series of studies beginning in 2005, another in 2008, and carried them on looking at men with prostate cancer and what would happen if they were provided with a similar kind of diet and lifestyle he used in the lifestyle heart trial. And one of the first things that was reported is that that basically genes could be turned on or off by changing your lifestyle. So your genes are not your destiny, if you will, but that the way you live could turn on cancer preventative type genes and turn off cancer promoting genes. And this was quite a revelation, I would say, at the time, and he went on to show that you could also affect the length of these little things at the ends of our chromosomes called telomeres, which essentially predict our longevity. And of course, as we age, one would expect the length of these telomeres would get a little shorter. And in fact, what happened when these folks were put on this diet and lifestyle program is they actually got slightly longer. So you could actually, again, change your destiny by changing your lifestyle. I think these studies were very important, and they opened a lot of doors for scientists in terms of looking at health and disease a little differently.